Hello everyone, and welcome to the FlightFactor 777. So this is the first part of a small mini-series I'm doing on the 777, and what I aim to do here is to just help out some newcomers or anyone who wants to learn more about the FlightFactor with some of the model-specific features. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about just general first steps when you get the product. I'm also going to talk about the plugin tab and hardware setup. So before we begin, I would like to just make a few quick disclaimers. First, if you will notice here, it says I am on version 2.0.9, and in the top right specifically, this is an alpha build. So this is not indicative of the final product. There may be some bugs in this build that I will report if I notice them, and there are some missing features. Aside from that, this is a FlightFactor specific series, so I'm not going to go in depth on some of the more general piloting things like FMC setup or the autopilot system. I'm mostly going to talk about what can be found on the FlightFactor. And in that vein, I would also like to say that most of my knowledge for this series is from personal testing. Now, I've been a tester for the 777 since day one. However, I may still miss some things, and I believe that most of the information in this series are the ones that will be used often, is what I'd say. And I'd also like to say finally that procedures vary. So especially when we get later on into the series with checklists and other stuff, I will say that it varies by company, and if your company wants you to do something else, then I'm quite positive that it would also work with the FlightFactor. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't. And just this aircraft is very in depth that I don't think they would accept only one way of doing things. Aside from that, this is more on the series itself, but I am running on a laptop, so both OBS and X-Plane. And so if you notice some blurry textures or if it's just not looking as good as you'd like, just remind yourself I am on a laptop and I am using FSR, so it's not going to look as good as it can be. Now, with that in mind, let's get started. When you first download the 777 and you load up X-Plane, as with any other FlightFactor product, you're not going to see this widget, but you're going to see a activation tab. It's part of Sassel, I believe. And with that, you basically copy your serial number from the store, and there's a paste button there. So you just click it, activate, and then reload the aircraft. Following that, you're still not going to see this widget, but you're going to see a welcome page. And what that welcome page basically says is that, this is very in-depth. It asks you to read the manual, and also I would say that it would be very beneficial. It would help a lot if you read the manual. However, once you dismiss that message, then you will get to this screen. And this screen is the first, I wouldn't say first time, it really depends on your setup, but this is a configuration screen for the aircraft. So you'll see a bunch of options here. First off, you have start with engines running. This one is pretty self-explanatory. If you select this, then the aircraft will start with engines running, displays on. You pretty much only have to select the FMC and everything. Aside from that, I would also say that if there is a green mark, then that option is selected. This goes for most of the menus in this aircraft. If there is a diamond here, just black, is not selected, green is selected. In fact, if you click start with engines running, you'll see reload because it needs to tell X-Plane that we're starting with engines running. Now after this, we have cold and dark type. Now in cold and dark type, there are three options. There is absolute, connected, and ready. Most of the time, I believe the most, I'd say realistic for day-to-day operations would probably be connected or ready. However, if it's your like first flight, I'd say absolute. So I'll just differentiate it real quick here. In absolute mode, there's nothing connected to your aircraft. I believe you're just on chocks, but you start outside the aircraft, doors are closed, you have to call in the stairs and everything to and open the door to get to the cockpit in the first place. In connected mode, you have the primary and secondary GPUs connected, but your battery is still off and you still have to do, full setup for the displays. However, doors are open and you have the GPU connected. You just have to close the circuit. Finally, there is ready mode, and in ready mode, you have, I believe you have all of the displays open, so you have the battery on, GPUs connected, and yeah, you just have to do pre-flight basically from there. Following that, by the way, if you check on the center of my screen at the bottom, there's a tooltip when you hover over things. That is enabled by default, so if you do have any confusion, then you could generally just check the tooltip and it will tell you some general information. But that aside, we also have maintenance types, and there are 5 in this aircraft. There's full manual, auto call equipment, per system, full automatic, and none. So I don't know a better way to explain it before we get into the EFB, but I'll try my best here. So full manual mode is where it's just on you for all the maintenance. You have to go to the EFB, check the maintenance page, and see what needs to be done. You can also check other systems on the aircraft and see if there's anything that needs to be done. And if that's the case, you have to go to the EFB maintenance page and you have to call the equipment first before doing the maintenance. So if you're in full manual mode, no maintenance will be done. I don't think it'll even let you select it until you go to the ground services page and call the relevant equipment. So say we have a blown tire. It's not gonna let you just replace the tire. You have to go to the ground services and you have to call the tire replacement kit and it has to arrive before you can ask them. This step is removed when you get to auto call equipment. Auto call equipment is, as it says, you just go to the maintenance tab on the EFB, and when you click on a system, you ask them to do maintenance. They're going to call the equipment for you. Honestly, I'd probably be better off setting it to auto call equipment. However, for the purposes of this tutorial, it will be full manual. Now, per system mode is interesting. So with per system mode, you only have to go to the EFB maintenance, but you don't have to check any data. You just click on the specific system, and it will do all the relevant maintenance for you. So how I describe this, how I differentiate it, is with full manual and auto call, when you click on the engines, for example, engine maintenance, it's going to give you a bunch of options for replace the blades, refill oil, all of that stuff. Per system, you only have to select engines and it will do all relevant maintenance. This moves us on to full automatic mode, which is, as it says, fully automatic. You don't have to worry about it. All you have to do is wait, because they will do all of the relevant maintenance procedures for you. However, it will still be a maintenance procedure, and thus it takes time. Finally, we have none mode that basically disables maintenance, and yeah, whenever you reload the aircraft or start a new flight or anything, it's just you're just not gonna have any failures, or your consumables will be brought back to default levels and everything. And as you can see, if I select none, it's going to disable the carry consumables mode. So following this, there's show this widget next time, and I'm going to just talk about this briefly. If you have this deselected for any reason, say accident, or you don't want to see this every time you just spawn into the cockpit, all of these options will be in the EFB. So I'll go into that in more detail later, but you just don't have to worry. You can really disable this widget. I prefer to keep it on, but you can disable it. So going on to the right column, we have physical time factor. And in this aircraft, they give you a lot of options. So you go from instantaneous all the way to real. And what this affects is things like ADIRU alignment, loading times. So if you want to load passengers, cargo, anything, it affects that, how long that takes. It also affects maintenance time. And that is the reason why I believe it was a good choice for FlightFactor to have so many options. Because if you set this to real, you're going to be waiting hours if you do maintenance. If you're, say, replacing a gear, they're going to do it in real time. That takes about 20-30 minutes per tire. And if you do something more substantial, like, let's say, engine maintenance, it's going to take a long time. So, however, you don't want either that or just instant, and so that's why I think it's a good idea to place so many options. Now, we move on to mean time between failures. This one is, this concerns the failure model, so there are random failures enabled. You can set this from too often to never, and when you have it never, it just doesn't fail. However, I like to keep it at around 100, gives a failure every now and then, and you have to still be somewhat alert. And remember, just remember with any aircraft, but specifically with the FlightFactor, this is a mean time between failures. Just broad. So it can go anywhere from a small sensor fault all the way up to engine failure. And so, you want to keep an eye on how long you set this, and you want to be attentive. Anyways, after this, we have inter-flight failures, where basically if you have a failure, you can still load the aircraft, as you can see in the bottom. And one of the things that I noticed is that in 2.0.9, this is actually disabled every time you reload the aircraft. So this doesn't save, and you have to enable it every time. I hope the devs fix that, because I think it's pretty important, but we'll see how that goes. Anyways, there's also carry consumables to the next flight. So this is more continuity. However, it also affects your maintenance. So what do we mean by consumables in this way? What we mean by consumables is stuff like how much fuel you have, how much oil is in the engine, hydraulic fluid. And this can be pretty interesting to use. Because, for example, I was doing a flight where I just didn't have any hydraulic fluid because it ran out it was brought down to a low level in the previous flight, and I didn't check it. And there are other stuff like your APU won't start if you don't have enough engine oil. It's just not gonna boot up at all, and so you have to troubleshoot that. And so I think this is a really fun option to have turned on, but as I said, you still need to be attentive if you do. And finally, we have fly from right seat. So FlightFactor gives you the option to fly from the captain's or first officer side, and this basically changes your default W key. So you know how in X-Plane, when you press W, it brings you back to cockpit view. So if you have this set to fly from right seat, W is gonna bring you to the first officer side. Now, with that aside, let's get started. Now, this is what you're going to first see if you're in absolute mode. So there are some things that I should probably disable. For example, SGES, spawns and cones. That's not part of it. So this is the first thing you'll see when you load in. Again, pardon the textures, laptop. But, yeah, doors are closed and you can't get in absolute mode. So how do you do it? This is what brings us to the plugin menu. So in the top left here, you're going to see, aside from the plugins, which has everything else you have this separate tab for the 777. Right now, -200ER, but FlightFactor, they're gonna have the 300ER, the other variants as well. So,
I guess we need the stairs to get it.
yes, I know, but in this plugin menu, it gives you some options. First off, you have your options for avionics. So these are some of the settings you can set. Cabin, you can do free luggage, random weights, simplified, checklists, effects, EFIS. These are all settings that are also in the EFB, and so I would really I'll talk about it more in the EFB section. There's equipment, and this is the part that's important. If you're starting from absolute mode, you want to go down to equipment, and you want to call the stairs. So there's main stairs and secondary stairs. This is the main stairs. There it is. Aside from that, I notice a lot of people don't know this, but in the plugin menu, you can also pop out the EFB. And this is it's really helpful when you're doing things like the walk around, which we will talk about in the future video. And finally, there's captain's briefing. Sorry, there's captain commands. So there's stuff like reading the briefing, which I find really nice. There's remove ground equipment, which we'll talk about in the communications section. There's also close hatches, request ground personnel, disconnect, all of that stuff. But now that we've talked about that, let's get started and get into the aircraft itself. So when you spawn in the stairs, you want to press W, and it's going to bring you up the stairs. It's going to open the door automatically, and it's going to bring you right outside. Cool, right? Anyways, from here on, you just press W again. It's going to bring you inside the cabin. Pardon the textures again. I'm actually still working on this delivery, so it's not yet done. And from here on, you just keep pressing W. 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 Until you get into the cockpit. And I don't know why it does this. Maybe it's because you're standing over the chair. Maybe that's what they're trying to simulate. But W and you're in. And so that's basically your first steps in this aircraft. And so now what I want to do is get into hardware setup, because I know that most of us would be flying this with, say, a yoke or a joystick, rudder pedals, throttle quadrant, and so I find this pretty helpful. But what FlightFactor has done is they created a specific data ref, a specific command that lets you get the Clickzone information. So I set mine to Control C, but this is what it's called. It's onesim mh get the Clickzone information parentheses clipboard. And what this does, I've set this to Control C, is it gets the data ref command, sorry, yeah, the command information when you hover over something. So, for example, I want to change the no. Yeah, let's bind the traffic button, shall we? If we want to bind the traffic button, I'm going to hover over the traffic button and I'm going to press Control C. And when I go into Notepad, for example, sorry about that, and Control V, it's going to tell me everything I need to know. So push button, Captain HSI, and this is your command. And I find that really helpful when you're trying to bind it. But aside from that, these are some of the non-command values I found. So stuff like the MCP and indicators. So like if a specific mode is selected, these are the ones I use. So yeah, feel free to screenshot if you want to use like a mini FCU or something like that. Now, with that aside, let's go into the throttle quadrants and everything. This is more specific to the Honeycomb equipment, but FlightFactor has actually set up specific commands for the Honeycomb. And what I find interesting is the stuff like auto throttle or the fuel cutoff. Because since FlightFactor made this specific to Honeycomb, it works with the Honeycomb way of doing things. So, for example, with other commands, if you have a fuel cutoff set here, when you switch it off on the Honeycomb, you see it's a separate binding. And that may not work always, but since FlightFactor did a Honeycomb specific setup, then you can see if I switch it on, it's gonna switch on. And even if I have nothing bound to switch off, when I switch it off, it's gonna switch off. And so that's what I find useful for a lot of the X-Plane setup. However, I also want to note with most hardware with the FlightFactor, something I've noticed is that the datarefs are not exposed when you first load up the aircraft. Now, what does this mean? What this means is that external programs like MobiFlight, SPAD.next, or anything don't have datarefs to base off of when you first load up. I believe the datarefs are exposed when you get past the widget, the config. So, if you're using, let's say, Honeycomb profiles, I find it just good practice when you load up to the aircraft, go into plugins, reload all of your bindings. Because sometimes when you load up, it's gonna say can't find this dataref because it's not exposed when you first load in. Anyways, that was the start, plugin tab, and hardware setup for the 777. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful for you. And in the next video, we will be talking about the EFB. Hope to see you then.